hasn't included grassroots people, and I'm sure that many of the people in this room feel similarly that they have been excluded from this decision-making process. So this tour was born from a desire to raise awareness about this project and the entire offshore industry. And we wanted to do so to bring people who are very knowledgeable about this industry to speak about the risks of offshore drilling so we can compare, or so that we can understand what those risks really are and ask ourselves, is it worth it? We believe this is really pertinent information here and now in Nova Scotia because this drilling might start as early as this spring. As I mentioned, I work at the Council of Canadians, and we believe that offshore drilling is not worth the risk to our communities, our fisheries, our coasts, our water, and our global climate. And that's the position that we're coming to you with today on behalf of the Council and the Campaign to Protect Offshore Nova Scotia, who is a major partner in this work. But I will explicitly say that each of the panelists has their own perspective and doesn't necessarily align with what I just described as the Council of Canadians' position. However, they do bring important knowledge and a lot of information that I think is critical for you all to know. So how this is going to work is we'll go one by one through the panelists. They'll make some opening remarks. At the end, there'll be a question and answer period. It's not a huge group, so I think probably everyone will get, I hope everyone will be able to have their questions answered. We might be live streaming, but I'm not sure if that's actually working yet. No, we're just recording, it's cool. That's the normal way. So yeah, some minor housekeeping things. I don't actually know where the bathrooms are in this place. Ideas?
Over there. In the
Over
hall.
there. If you need to go to the bathroom, it's back there. Questions will be at the end. I would like to not delay any further in introducing our very special guest, all the way from California, Antonia. Juhasz. She's a leading energy analyst, author, and investigative journalist specializing in oil. She's an award-winning writer. Her articles have appeared in more outlets that I think I really could mention right now.
But maybe mention some.
I could mention a few, yeah. Newsweek, Rolling Stone, Harper's Magazine, The Atlantic, CNN, The Nation, The Advocate, and many more. She's also written a book which is for sale after this talk. She's the author. The book is called Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill, and it is a searing look at the human face of BP's disaster in the Gulf about 8 years ago. I would like to turn it to Antonia, who will tell us all about her investigations and what she has learned as an unbiased reporter.
Hang on.
Oh, yeah, we have to look at the maps.
No, don't start mine yet. Why don't you go ahead and look at the maps first? Yep.
Can I get the map on there? Right. So, as I mentioned, BP has been approved to drill up to 7 wells. Their plan so far is to drill 1, possibly this year. And I just wanted to point out where exactly this is. I am a visual person. I imagine many of you are. So we're looking at a map of Nova Scotia, Georges Bank, and the Atlantic Ocean. BP's lease area is the first one on the right side of the screen there. And as you can see, I like this map because it shows where the currents flow. So one of the things that BP has said in their description of their project is that if there was a spill, it'd be unlikely to reach the shore and it would take quite a while to do so. I hope the panelists will mention more about this later. But if we look at this graphic, we can see that the currents don't quite behave that way, and there's a real risk that oil spilled from BP's project could actually come towards Nova Scotia by getting caught in a current and actually enter the Bay of Fundy, which is a critical fishing area, as we all know. Also of note here is that Stat Oil, another oil company, is trying to do exploration later. Hasn't done
They have a lease.
They have a lease, but haven't started their work yet. And it's very close to the border of the U.S. waters. And as many of you may know, the U.S. has for a long time not allowed any drilling on their Atlantic coast, but President Trump has recently. Pardon? Yeah, Antonia will talk more about it, but until very recently, there has been no drilling allowed on the Atlantic coast. And so, knowing that Canada has approved drilling very close to those waters, and water doesn't respect international boundaries because they're made up by people, this poses a problem not only for us, but also for American fishers. So, there's one more map that shows, oh, there it is. This is just a different representation of the same kind of area that shows some of the fishing areas. I don't think that I have the expertise to get deeply into this. Maybe Colin can tell us more later, and if anyone has questions, feel free. But this shows some of the fishing areas, shows different depths of the water. Something important to note, as I did, is that BP is planning to drill some of their wells twice as deep as their Deepwater Horizon disaster. And so this is another look at some of the different leases and fishing areas. So if Antonia is ready and her slideshow is also ready, I will turn it over. I cannot wait to hear what Antonia has to say. I've been learning a lot from this woman in the last day and a half that I've known her, and I hope she'll share some of her incredible knowledge with all of us now.
Thanks, Robin. It's not starting?
Yeah, be able to hit flip. No? Yeah, just let it go. Here it goes. Yes. You don't have to touch anything.
Anybody know how to do it?
It's only 2 minutes long. You want to start it from the top, folks, or you got?
Yes, please.
Yeah, you can just pull the arrow back from the start, and I'll start again. It's very short. Just click on the front. Yeah. Yeah, we'll just start. Thanks very much. one up, or sorry, the last one up, if it'll stay, maybe it wants to go back to the top. If there's a way to make the last one stay, if not, it's all right. And we can bring the lights back up. You can come all the way up, would be great.
Thank you. And thanks, Robin. I'm going to try and stand, but it may be a little hard for me to read. I'm going to start my timer. Yeah. Ooh, it doesn't want to stay there, does it? It's all right. Yeah, you did it. Thank you. And maybe if we could get the lights all the way up, that would be awesome. I'll just keep talking in the dark. All right, thank you all so much for having me. Thank you, Robin, for introducing me. My name again is Antonia Juhasz, and I'm here from San Francisco. I'm an investigative journalist, and I specialize in oil. And I have fallen into a specialty which includes offshore oil drilling as a result of, in the wake of the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, I immediately went down to the Gulf of Mexico to start covering the disaster, was gripped by the events that led to it, the impacts of it, the impacts on, and all of these lights would be awesome. We don't really need that to be the highlight. I want me to be the highlight, and I want to be able to see folks in the audience if I can. So if we can get those lights, that'd be awesome.
We're working on it.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So I was captured by the impacts on the fishers, the 11 men who died on the rig, their families, their colleagues, the impacts on how beautiful these beaches were, how beautiful this environment was, the incredible diversity of species. And as someone who had lived in California, had lived on the East Coast, grew up in Colorado, I had no idea of the beauty and richness of the US Gulf of Mexico until I came down to explore the impacts of the largest offshore drilling oil spill in world history. So the Deepwater Horizon disaster, which I then wrote about, once I got there, I realized it needed to be more than articles. As Robin said, I write for media outlets. I decided I needed to write a book, so I wrote a whole book called Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill. I continued to go down to the Gulf and write more articles and follow up for the next, now it's nearly been 8 years, in addition to investigating and writing on offshore oil drilling around the world and across the country and other wide diversity of oil operations. The people of the Gulf Coast were so incredibly gracious with their time and their stories. And I got to interview and spend time with, as I said, family members of the deceased on the rig, people who had been working on the rig, their family members and had survived, people who had been working on nearby rigs, as I said, fisher folk, environmentalists, oil company executives, elected officials, policymakers, and was able to really get, and particularly over the years of coverage, a very deep understanding of the events that caused the disaster and the continued impacts of it. And it offers a tremendous amount of lessons learned for operations that have continued across the world and the operations that are proposed here. So the slideshow that I just showed includes pictures from the Gulf of Mexico, but that's not all that was in there. So there were also pictures of an oil spill that happened in Santa Barbara, California in 1969. That was the black and white photo. In 1969, there was an oil spill, an offshore oil spill in Santa Barbara, California that led at that time to the largest offshore drilling oil spill in US history. As a response, Californians organized to ban offshore drilling in California. The movement spread across the country. It led eventually to moratoriums being put in place on the rest of the Pacific. The only thing that was grandfathered in were those existing rigs that were already there. The Atlantic, parts of Alaska, and basically the sort of oil sacrifice zone for the United States continued to be the Gulf of Mexico, and that's where drilling continued, and that's where the vast majority of drilling exists in the United States. with the exception of Florida, because it's so important for its tourism. It's also so important in US presidential politics that when the Floridians say, don't drill here, the federal government listens, and while there is drilling in all the rest of the Gulf of Mexico, there is no drilling in the Florida coast, and there is no drilling in the Atlantic. While the senior President Bush put in place these presidential moratoriums, the younger President Bush lifted them, but there is still no drilling in the Atlantic coast. There is still basically no drilling in the Pacific, other than the grandfathered in areas. There's still no drilling in Florida. There's limited drilling in Alaska, and the Gulf of Mexico is the area where there is the most drilling. Other pictures, though, that were included there is even with the limited drilling that we still have in California, just a couple years ago, ExxonMobil had another oil spill in Santa Barbara. But this one was, as opposed to offshore, the oil traveling from offshore had to be carried by pipe inshore, and then it travels along shore. The pipe along the shore sprung a massive leak, and oil poured out and poured out and poured out and poured out, and they didn't detect it by all the technology that they have in the pipelines. Instead, a guy was walking the line and saw it, and saw this enormous oil spill that continued for days and days and days, and that was some of the photographs you saw were the most recent Santa Barbara oil spill. Some of the photographs you also saw were the largest, after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, the largest offshore drilling oil spill we've had in the Gulf of Mexico happened less than 2 years ago. And it was a Shell oil rig that was drilling out in the Gulf of Mexico. They had already been producing oil, and it was from a pipeline that connected the oil well to an offshore rig, and all of this is way out in the water. So it's a deep water well that's connected by pipe to an offshore operation. That pipe sprung a leak. This is less than 2 years ago, remember. This is when all the lessons learned from Deepwater Horizon were supposed to have been implemented. I'm working my way back to that. And what happened was the two guys who were in the control room had less than 2 years experience between them. They were supposed to have what was called a mentor, a senior advisor there. He was on vacation. So they noticed a huge drop in pressure. And they didn't know where to look because they hadn't been trained to look at a possible spill, at a possible break in the pipe. So while they were trying to figure out what had gone wrong, again, none of the technology on the rig told them what went wrong. A helicopter was flying overhead, and a helicopter saw that massive sheen that you saw, the picture that said Greenpeace on it. The reason why it's a Greenpeace photo is they're the only ones who got a photo of it. So that spill was spotted by a helicopter. They then figured out that they had to shut in the well, and in the interim, 90,000 gallons of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. Again, all the lessons learned since BP Deepwater Horizon, they still only got barely a quarter of that oil recovered. And this was less than 2 years ago. Some of those pictures were also from the worst oil tanker disaster that's happened in years, and the worst one carrying a oil product called condensate. So those explosions weren't the Deepwater Horizon picture. That was the Sanchi oil tanker in the East China Sea. That was a tanker carrying oil, and I know they're gonna be tankering here and do tanker here. That tanker ran into a ship carrying grain. It was carrying condensate. It exploded, and it let loose a spill. And that's in the last couple months. And then those were pictures also from Deepwater Horizon. So Deepwater Horizon was the largest offshore drilling oil spill in world history. 5 million gallons of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico over 3 months' time. Barrels, excuse me. Thank you very much for the correction. Sorry, excuse me. So I want to read a quote that I start my book with. And this was one of the interviews I did with, this is a man who I later interviewed, who was one of the men who was working on the Deepwater Horizon at the time of the explosion. And this is in congressional testimony that he gave. His name is Stephen Lainstone. He said, and he was a roustabout on the Deepwater Horizon, "This event was set in motion years ago by these companies needlessly rushing to make money faster while cutting corners to save money. When these companies put their savings over our safety, they gambled with our lives. They gambled with my life. They gambled with the lives of 11 of my crew members who will never see their families or loved ones again. One of the other interviews I did was with a young man who was working on a rig nearby Deepwater Horizon when it exploded. And his pregnant wife was among many other family members who there was a total communication shut off for any rigs that were out in the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody could call home, no one could communicate home. So their family members didn't know, all people knew is that there was an explosion. They didn't know what rig, they didn't know what happened, they just knew something bad had happened in the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm in Mississippi interviewing this young man, his young wife, and their 1-month-old baby is sitting on the counter. And he says to me, when you start a new job, it's all about safety. But after you're out there for so long, you find you can save $2 million here or $3 million there, and they start cutting corners, save whatever money they can. I've seen them all cut corners they shouldn't cut. They all do it. Shell, Chevron, they all do it. They hit a comfort zone, get complacent. Could do it a little cheaper, could do it a little differently. And yeah, eventually the worst happens. But you know, we're paid to go out there, and you have confidence in the decisions they make. Doesn't do no good to worry and stress about it, because there's nothing you can do about it anyway. His wife didn't agree, and he didn't go back out into the offshore after that. Those words, though, I was reminded to read them because they were almost exactly what the Shell employees in that instance that I just told you told the investigators. They said, you know, we weren't trained, but we trusted that the equipment was going to work right, and, you know, we assumed that the risk was going to be taken care of. And that's when this Shell incident happened. So let me, hang on one sec. So one of the things about the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster is that it is in the United States, and as a result had to deal with very stringent laws that we have in the US that are in place as a result of the Exxon Valdez disaster. And one of those is the Oil Pollution Act, which required that BP take responsibility for the disaster, and that in essence it tried to put everything back the way it was, which included pretty stringent laws on making payments to fishers or local businesses, which I'll get back to. But it also included a requirement that there be a natural damage assessment, which meant that the federal government needed to spend many years calculating the impacts of the disaster. And so this oil spill has been exceptionally well studied, and there is an enormous amount of information about it. And let me read some of the findings of those studies. And I'm just going to go into death reports for right now. So 11 men died on the rig, as I said. The full damages assessment found that as many as 8.3 billion oysters in the Gulf were lost as a result of the oil spill, and that the subsequent dramatic decreases in oyster densities and the associated reproductive injury imperils the sustainability of oysters in the northern Gulf of Mexico. The oil spill killed as many as 5 trillion larval fish. Up to 20% of the Kemp's Ridley adult female turtles in the Gulf were also killed. According to this report, at least 93 species of birds were exposed to BP oil, with brown and white pelicans, laughing gulls, black skimmers, white ibis, double-crested cormorants, common loons, I'm going to get that right one of these nights, and several species of terns particularly hard hit. Nearly all of the populations of dolphins and whales in affected areas have demonstrable, quantifiable injuries. In the 5 years after the disaster, more than 3/4 of pregnant bottlenose dolphins in the oiled areas failed to give birth to viable calf. Their populations could ultimately decline by more than half before they recover, which could take as long as 50 years. The most affected species of marine mammal living in deeper waters were Bride's whales, nearly half were exposed to oil, and nearly a quarter died, jeopardizing the possible survival of the species in the Gulf. The BP oil spill, initially what BP had said was, one of the things that they're required to do in the United States is file an oil, they're required to file an oil spill response in order to get their lease. What will they do if there's a disaster? What will they do if there's a spill? One of the things they said was that they knew how to deal with a deepwater blowout. What we found out when it happened was that not only did they not know, but no one in the industry knew. And instead they started applying shallow water technologies to a deep water well. So a shallow water well is 100, 200, 300 feet of water. This was 5,000 feet of water. And it took them 3 months of experimentation, during which the entire 3 months oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I had the opportunity to spend 2 weeks on a scientific research vessel out in the Gulf, including riding in the Alvin submarine to the bottom of the ocean at the site of the BP oil spill 2 years after the spill, getting closer to the Macondo well than anyone other than BP had gotten at that point. And I was with Dr. Samantha Joy, an amazing scientist with expertise in the hydrocarbons in ocean waters. And the first thing that we saw that was important down there at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, at the site of the disaster, 2 years later, was what we didn't see. So the sea life that could get away, tried to get away. All the sea life that couldn't was buried under the oil. And a very, very limited amount of sea life had returned. So basically what I saw was a moonscape. And Dr. Joy, who had done submarines to that same area in the Alvin prior to, was heartbroken at the lack of life. But in some ways, she was even more heartbroken by the bits of life that we did see. Because when we were down there, she took samples of oil samples of soil from around the site. And she had done the same thing before the oil spill, and she had done the same thing right after, and then she had done the same thing on this trip. And what she saw was up to 2 inches of a blanket of oil, estimated at 30 million gallons of oil, that remains on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. It is expected that that will remain essentially forever because it is very cold and dark at the bottom of the ocean. It's a perfect refrigerator. What she also found is that the oil that has remained is essentially the most toxic remnants of the oil. And that's because there are what we like to call the mighty Macondo microbes that could. These are the little microbes that do naturally eat some oil. They do feast away at it. And they were given a lot of credit by a lot of people for their ability to feast away at the oil. Don't worry, the oil will disappear because the microbes will get it. Well, the microbes worked really hard to eat oil, but they could only eat so much, and they certainly couldn't eat what was being handed to them. But they ate what they could, and then they pooped away what they didn't want. And what they didn't want was the most toxic parts of the oil. And what Dr. Joy describes is the microbial snot highway that then carried those toxic parts down to the bottom of the ocean, as well as oil that just fell down and stayed down. And so what we're worried about, and what they have studied moving through the food chain, is that there are species that are coming back to the bottom of the Gulf and are eating that oil and have been eating it as it passed through the Gulf and were exposed to it from the very beginning. And so the oil is making its way up through the food chain as the little worms eat it, and they're eating and they're moving up. And so that dead whale that you saw the picture of was sent to me from a group called Gulf Restoration Network in Louisiana that has been recording deaths of species for long before the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. And they said these new sightings of dead whales on the beach is new, and it matches with the data that I read about the dolphin deaths, which are species at the top of the food chain, dolphins and whales, still suffering, showing that the providing evidence that the food chain continues to suffer all the way up, as is the evidence of the federal study that I read the data from. But the other evidence of the continued suffering of the Gulf Coast is in the suffering of the fishers and the fisherfolk. So immediately after, when the oil hit, fisheries were shut down, and there wasn't fishing. Fisheries were then opened up slowly, and we were told that Gulf fish was safe to eat. Now, one of the problems of the initial studies, and I bring this up because it's important to understand what's behind studies, not just the data that's being presented, was that the Food and Drug Administration presented studies that it was safe to consume Gulf seafood. I just need to make sure it doesn't go off. Based on a study of the average diet of the average American. And the average diet of the average American, it turns out, was a 170-pound man who lives in the middle of America. So his diet and his body was okay, which is great. I'm happy for him. But if you are a Gulf resident, you consume a lot more seafood. If you're a Nova Scotia resident, you consume a lot more seafood than a 170-pound man in Toronto. But what if you're a pregnant woman? The exposure to oil and the chemical corrects it has a different impact on your body. What if you're a baby? What if you're a toddler? What if you're an elderly person? What if you're an ill person? And once scientists started looking at those factors, particularly a rich diet, meaning you eat more than the average person of the seafood from that place, the results were much more startling and disturbing. And that was from exposure to both the oil and the corrects. But in terms of the ongoing impacts on the fishers, I've been getting updated data regularly from NOAA, the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, which measures the fish catches in the United States. So they measured, in the first years after the spill, there wasn't anything to measure because the fisheries were shut down. Then the catch was so low, it started rising, but it has never recovered to where it was prior to the spill. So this is the latest data that I got from them literally as I was on the plane to come here. And this shows for 2016, the most recent data, that Gulf-wide catches of oysters declined by 6.6 million pounds between 2009, before the oil spill, until 2016 after, while shrimp catches declined by 37.5 million pounds. Over the same period, the percentage of U.S. oysters from the Gulf fell from 61% to 45%, while Gulf shrimp declined from 81% to 72% today. Now, I have a lot of interviews that I won't have time to go into with small local fishers, and they tell me, and again, I did a interview with the head of the Louisiana Oystermen's Association right before I came here to get the latest information from him. And he said, Antonia, we're ruined where we are in Pointe-à-la-Hache, Louisiana. And he said, because we are small fisher folk. And the small fisher folk took one-time payments that were offered to them by BP. Because BP had said at the very beginning, we know how to fix this, right? Remember I said that? Turned out they didn't. They said it's going to take a week to fix it. It'll take 2 weeks. It'll take 3 weeks. It'll take a month. It'll take 2 months. It'll take a little more than 2 months. It took 3 months. But when they first came around, they said, we'll give you a $5,000 payment if you sign a contract that says you won't ever ask for any more money and you won't ever sue us. The little fishers took that money. The little hotel owners took that money. The little restaurant tours took that money. The people who didn't were the big commercial industries that could hold out and sue and wait for years and years and years. And they won, lots of them did. But the little guys, many of them got crushed, just crushed. And it's the big commercial enterprises that came in. Now, let me just talk real quick about this proposal that BP has put forward, and Robin did a great job of showing the slides of what's happening there, but there's a couple of important pieces on what lessons have and haven't been learned. So BP in the Gulf of Mexico was drilling a deep water well. What they're proposing here includes 7 wells, which includes an ultra deep water well, at least one ultra deep water well, which is at 3,000 meters, which is twice the depth of where they were drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. It also includes drilling within 48 kilometers of Sable Island National Park, which is 30 kilometers closer than the closest land to which they were drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. So closer access to oil if there is a spill, and much deeper to get to. We learned in the Deepwater Horizon disaster that there were many pieces that led to the disaster, and these comments from the workers were repeated in Federal Judge Carl Barbier's final ruling on why the Deepwater Horizon disaster happened. The federal district judge who was responsible for finding out what happened said, this happened because BP was making decisions based on saving time and saving money. They were putting profit ahead of every other decision. And we can walk down the line, and we can do it in questions if you want, on what happened. One of the things that happened, though, that's critical, is that the key piece of equipment that protects you from a blowout, and just to be clear, BP, it seems like, has been saying to reassure people, this is just an exploratory well. Okay? You're nodding. Okay. The vast majority of blowouts happen in the developmental and exploratory phase of drilling. It's exploratory drilling. They're drilling a hole to see if there is oil or natural gas. It's in these pre-phases, development and exploration, that the vast majority of blowouts happen. BP happened in pre-production as well. By the time they're producing, often things are sort of moving well and the systems are in place. Exploration and development can be far more dangerous and leads to more blowouts. The blowout preventer is the key piece of equipment that stops a blowout. The blowout preventer ran out of batteries. And that's why it didn't deploy. But even if it could deploy, blowout preventers only work 50% of the time. BP spent 3 months figuring out what to do. They figured out that they should have a capping stack. They finally put in place a capping stack. A capping stack is basically if you've got a bottle of champagne and you pop it and you want to kind of save what's in it, you put one of those little, pops in there so it temporarily holds it. The capping stack is a temporary solution. But one of the things we learned is you should have a capping stack ready because that's the way you temporarily shut it in. But here, the closest capping stack they're going to have is in Norway. And that's the capping stack they're going to have. So that was a lesson learned that doesn't seem to have been applied. The other thing that we learned is the only way to permanently shut in a blown out well is to drill another well. And so just to make sure that's clear, you drilled a well, it caused a catastrophic incident, and the only solution to fixing it is to drill another well. That took 152 days in the Gulf of Mexico to drill the other well and then intersect with the original well and shut it in. But they know that that's the only way to fix it. So one of the proposals that was a lesson learned after Deepwater Horizon is while you're drilling your first well, you drill your second well at the same time. They're not doing that. I could go on much longer, obviously, and I won't. But what is troubling when looking at this proposal is that BP's proposal, is that it seems to paint the rosiest picture, providing the least sense of risk and the most capable way of dealing with it without having the proof in the pudding to demonstrate the very rosy scenario that they've painted. So I really appreciate you having me here to share these experiences, and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Antonia. It's frightening, but it's good to hear some of the issues and some of the problems that we've faced in the Gulf of Mexico. Nova Scotia faces a number of tough and hard decisions in terms of how to protect the renewable resources that we have available here. And the issues that Antonia has brought forward are critically important, and they relate specifically to the drilling of wells and the safe activities that have to be undertaken in order to do that in a way that doesn't imperil the renewable resources that we all depend on. But we, right here in southwest Nova Scotia, are facing another oil industry activity, which is just about to start to take place this spring, which is called seismic testing. And I'll just go back 2 years and very briefly tell you that when the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board first opened up lease sites on the Scotian Shelf, and this is back in 2015, we noted with interest that they had sites that they were prepared to lease that were directly contingent to the moratorium area on Georges Bank, which is the incubator for our fishery in many ways. That is one of the richest biological sites on the planet, and we depend on it for scallop and lobster and haddock as an incubator site for spawn and a nursery area. And we asked them, look, please, we understand that what your efforts are, but let's not drill or provide lease sites that are directly contingent to that area. Well, they, as quickly as possible, leased that site to Statoil. And so Statoil now has a lease site which is directly contingent to the moratorium area on Georges Bank. They also had lease sites that were contingent to, and in fact take in the southeastern corner of an area of Browns Bank called LFA 40. And LFA 40 is the only closed lobster spawning site on the Scotian Shelf. And we said, look, would you please not lease sites directly there? And the response was, no, we're going to lease sites there. We've decided it's a safe area to lease sites, and at any time that an oil industry proponent wants to lease those sites, they will be leased. So, returning to the Georges Bank issue, Statoil was about to start its seismic work. In 2012, the DFO, our Department of Fisheries and Oceans, came up with a number of recommendations and conditions upon which seismic work should take place. And in 2015, some DFO scientists did a bunch of work which suggested that those recommendations were inadequate. So now you have seismic activity that's just about to take place with Statoil using the 2012 regulatory procedures, which DFO scientists have now said are inadequate. And CNSOPB seems to be very happy with that process, and at this point, the Statoil proposals for seismic work are going forward. Seismic is another form of pollution. Sound pollution is an immensely damaging process in the process of exploring for oil formation. And the new information that's coming out makes it absolutely clear that it's not only damaging to the whales and mammals, it's damaging to the spawn of scallop, it's damaging to the phytoplanktons that the food chain depends on, it's damaging to lobster and to finfish. And we need to now begin to ask some serious questions of CNSOPB. I do not like to have to bring another problem forward. We've been dealing with numbers and numbers of issues that relate to the regulatory process other than just the oil and gas industry itself. Peter Puxley is going to speak next, and Peter is an economist, and he is one of the founding members of CPONS, which is the committee to protect offshore Nova Scotia. Peter is, one of the things that Peter will speak to is a concrete pathway, a way that has already been explored in Canada that allows communities like ours to be involved in the decision-making about what happens to our natural resources and to our environment. So at this point, I'm going to turn this microphone over to Peter and have you listen to some of these points. Thanks, Peter.
It's like it's not gonna.
Do a little dance.
Let me just first garrot the rest of the panel here. Given the picture that Antonia has painted, I've heard it several times, and each time learned something new. She has so much to pass on, but it's painted so ably, and the horrendous after effects of the BP Macondo blowout in the Gulf. You're probably asking yourself the question of the day, which is, why is BP's drilling program, Statoil's, Shell's, why are these drilling programs in offshore Nova Scotia about to go ahead despite the science and despite the risk? In the 2015 federal election campaign, Canadians wanted a renewed commitment from the various parties to restore and strengthen protections for the environment that had been damaged during the Harper era. And they wanted the new government to address the threat of galloping catastrophic climate change. And to their credit, the Trudeau Liberals made brave promises. They would, quotes, make environmental assessment credible again. They recognized there was a real problem. They'd do so by restoring robust oversight, thorough environmental assessments, ensuring that decisions were based on science, facts, and evidence. I'm quoting from their document. Ensuring Canadians and independent experts would have an opportunity to express their views. That's a very important one, which I think they've yet to deliver on. Demanding developers use the best technologies available, and ensuring that environmental assessments include an assessment of the contribution they would make, each project would make, to the greenhouse gas emissions that are contributing to our rapidly deteriorating climate. And most important, this is really crucial, the Liberal platform made a remarkable statement, and I quote, "While governments grant permits for resource development, only communities can grant permission. Only communities can grant permission," unquote. I'd like to take a look at that, the importance of that statement from the perspective of risk, because we keep talking about risk here, but it's a more complex thing than it is often presented. Risk assessment is a sophisticated and mathematical art. You can be sure that when BP applied to drill its Macondo well in the Gulf, it provided the US regulators with an assessment of the risk of a blowout, backed by the best engineers their money could buy. And their conclusion was that a blowout was, and you'll see this phrase over and over again if you look at the literature, extremely unlikely, unquote. And the regulators accepted that assurance because they'd been presented with some pretty impressive science, and they approved the project. And it's in its environmental impact assessment for its Scotian Shelf drilling program, BP claims it's learned the lessons of the Macondo disaster. Once again, it claims that a blowout in Nova Scotia's offshore at twice the depth, as Antonia said, is extremely unlikely. And the federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, has accepted those words and given BP Ottawa's blessing. The Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board, being basically a group of former industry veterans, is sure to agree that the risk of a catastrophe at the BP drill site is extremely low. But is that conclusion enough to give development the go-ahead? I would say, of course, not. Whatever one thinks about its scientific basis, and history provides us with plenty of reason to be skeptical of the low-risk claim, two other key pieces of information are needed. The first one is, what's the potential benefit from this development, and is it sufficient to entertain the risk it entails? And then the second one, very critical question, is when all things are considered, is the risk acceptable? Those are different questions. Well, I don't have time to go into a great deal of detail on this front because we've limited time here and there's a lot to be said.
Could you put the mic closer to your mouth? There's somebody using a phone.
I'm sorry. The economic benefits from proceeding with another offshore development are greatly exaggerated. The employment benefits for Nova Scotians, for example, run to about 300 jobs a year, if you look back on the history of the oil industry activity in Nova Scotia. If you look at the funds that they pay to the provincial treasury, over a 16-year period, they amounted to $1.8 billion. That sounds like a lot of money, but it's less, or it's about what the value of lobster exports were last year from Nova Scotia. So over 16 years, they paid $1.8 billion in royalties. It's a little over $100 million a year. You'll probably hear more about this later, but to be subtracted from that is a commitment the Nova Scotia government made to the industry at the very beginning of all this was to pay for the decommissioning costs of these wells, and that runs almost up to $200 million. So we're talking about not a substantial amount of money, particularly when you compare it to the alternatives. And alternative investments should be a part of the picture. More to the point, Minister McKenna gave BP the green light to explore for new oil and gas, high-cost new oil and gas reserves, when the best opinion around the world concludes that anywhere from 40 to 80%, depending on who you're talking to, of Canada's known reserves of oil and gas must remain in the ground if we're to meet our commitments, our climate change commitments, our Paris commitments. So I would ask, how on earth Minister McKenna and her boss, Mr. Trudeau, justify searching for new high-cost, high-risk oil and gas that has to remain in the ground if we were to meet our climate change commitments. So we've got a development with few net economic benefits that increases the likelihood of catastrophic climate change. And given the enormous threat to our economic base, our communities, our marine ecosystems, it boggles my mind at least, however small the risks, why we should deem those risks acceptable at all. And surely the question of what is an acceptable risk is the most critical determination to be made of all. And who makes that decision? Well, the Liberals got it right in their election platform. While governments grant permits for resource development, only communities can grant permission. The question of what is an acceptable risk is fundamentally a political question. It's not a scientific one. The legitimate answer can only come from those who bear the lion's share of that risk. Yes, only communities can grant permission. The fact that Mr. Trudeau is now our Prime Minister doesn't alter the truth of the assertion he made on the campaign trail. So I would put it to you that the approval of BP's drilling program, after a process that did not involve public participation and certainly not the thorough involvement of the communities who are likely to bear the risk of that development, that this represents first and foremost a failure of Canadian democracy. And the exclusion of our communities from the decision-making process is not an oversight fact, but an essential piece of the puzzle. Again, I've limited time to enlarge on this, but we talk of captured regulators. And like the Canada Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board, back in the history of regulation, regulation originally was opposed vehemently by big business. Big business has come to love regulation because it removes major decisions about developments from the political process and hands them over to boards like the CNSOPB that happen to be peopled by veterans of the industries they are supposed to regulate and police. And they think like the industry, and they have a mandate to facilitate. And the CNSOPB, it's in their legislation. They are there really to facilitate the safe development. That's an important qualification, but they're there to facilitate the activities of the industry. And there's a fundamental conflict of interest inherent in their mandate. The influence, though, of the oil industry goes far beyond the way it has captured the regulators that are meant to look after our interests in their activities. It extends into the relevant departments, the Department of Natural Resources federally, provincially, Department of Environment, and the government itself. Many of the people elected come from the industry. Kevin Taft, who's a former leader of the Liberal Party in Alberta, albeit a sliver of the legislature, but someone with a lot of experience, has written a very interesting book, very readable, very well-researched book called Oil's Deep State. And he documents there the way in which the industry has infiltrated really our decision-making processes, our government. And he sees